Hello and welcome. My name is Samuel Ray, also known as Dr. Sam to many, and this is S-Factor Labs. And today with me, I called in Professor Xander Turing to discuss a topic. How are you doing, Professor?
I'm doing wonderfully. As a formal introduction, I happen to also be a science boy in the FGC. I'm working on game dev for my own game project since I have a number of hangups with just about every fighting game I play. I'd like to answer a few problems that I have with games here and there, and answer a few questions that the community might have about how we can improve kind of the stagnancy of fighting game design going forward.
Yeah, be the change you like to see, right? If you're not seeing what you like, make it yourself. And since you're a game dev here on the independent level, I actually felt you were perfect for the topic that I wanted to get a second opinion on. And that's actually the name of this series, is Second Opinion, because it's where I'm going to be revisiting topics that I already discussed alone in my Morning Boot Up series, where I just kind of ramble on my own thoughts on something. And so I figured who better to have for the first episode of that than you. And in this topic, because several weeks back, I discussed limitations in games and game design, gameplay, and such. Because oftentimes I'll see people talk about having limitations on what they can do as an inherently negative thing, especially in the fighting game space. When, like, you have games with more controlled and limited movement, for example, like you take those people who like your Marvel's Capcoms or Dragon Ball Fighters and put them in a game like Street Fighter, right? And they feel like it's just too restrictive. That's usually what they equate limitation with, restriction. And then they always kind of refer to it as a bad thing. Like, no, this is too restrictive, it's boring, There was one time where I was at my local FGC scene, and I was competing in Tekken 7, but after Tekken 7 was done, after I was out of bracket, I think I went 2-1 or like 3-2 or something like that. Then we had a little mini bracket for Samurai Showdown, the one released in 2019. And since there was only like 8 people to enter it, they just decided to have it be a free bracket. No prize money, just for fun, And one of the guys who played in it, and filled up the bracket, after he was knocked out, you could tell it was not his game. He was like,
yeah,
he did pretty well, honestly, for someone who plays almost exclusively anime, air dasher, hyper fighter kind of games. But when it came to Samurai Showdown, his general prevailing sentiment was that it was boring, and slow. And for me, I really thrive in that kind of game where it's more, slower, methodical, very mind game heavy, very much about the interactions between the two players mentally. Make a mistake, you eat a bunch of damage if you eat the wrong move, like those heavies that do 40% in Samurai Showdown.
Absolutely.
And then I thought about it though, and it always made me think, because it's a very common sentiment that slow equals boring, right? Or limitations equal restriction. But I thought that when you have certain limitations, it really gives an opportunity to expand the depth in ways that aren't tied to complexity. And it adds a certain level of structure. Like if you compare the likes of in real life combat sports, boxing, which is more, structured and restricted, you compare that to MMA, right? Where there's much less restrictions on what you can do. Or you compare fencing to either of those two, right? Fencing is extremely structured. Heck, it's basically a real life 2D fighting game because you're stuck on a narrow,
narrow band,
narrow flooring, and you walk forward and backwards only. But those games, those sports are extremely deep and nuanced because the athletes, they learn how to have creative techniques, varied techniques within the restrictions, right? In boxing, you can't strike below the belt, so that limits where you can strike to the torso and the head, right? So that's the only areas they can strike you at. So then you have to be creative about how and when and where you strike, right? As well as where you defend. And I always thought that that was actually made boxing like much more enjoyable and respectable than something like, I don't know, in my opinion, honestly, just these really wonky, crazy, aggressive fighting games where it's like the mental stack, the things you got to keep track of are insanely just vast, right? And so to the point where sometimes defense feels impossible.
Absolutely.
And so it just made me, I've always had that thought process of like, like was said by a Nintendo developer. And this is where I want to tie it into your experiences in game dev and let you take the floor. There's a phrase that came from someone who worked on, I believe it was one of the Mario games, one of the more highly acclaimed ones from the retro days. Limitation breeds creativity. What do you think about that statement there?
That is a sentiment I agree with, but there's a number of different contexts that we can apply it, and I'm trying to think how that could factor in specifically to what we'd be talking about with my game. I actually happen to be one of those guys who mostly likes air dashers, but for the most part, it's Guilty Gear, and I even prefer the older Guilty Gears versus Strive, even though Strive actually leans more towards that more controlled, restrictive environment.
Yeah.
But it does seem to lean a bit heavier into the offense, and that might be just because it's a lot more explosive in the fact that if you do make a mistake, you tend to lose a lot more for it.
Yeah.
So, on the topic of restrictions breeding creativity, I think one part of that is, like you said with the mental stack, when it comes to a fighting game, for example, the more options that you have offensively makes defense weaker. So, if you have a game in which you can hit someone with a huge mix-up or ridiculous amounts of pressure from anywhere, then it's mostly about trying to throw a bunch of random options at your opponent until something gets through. But if you have fewer options, like what you've mentioned with boxing, I think it becomes a lot more mind game centric. So there's a lot more creativity in reading and trying to understand your opponent rather than, say, for example, rolling the dice. Not to say that you don't get a chance to do that with somewhat more complex offensive games, but after a certain point, it's an inevitability that someone's going to be opened up by 4 or 5 way mix-ups that your character is going to be able to do.
Yeah, and about the phrase limitation breeds creativity, in the context of the developer statement, they were talking more about like limitations in the technology at the time and what they had available to them in their game development, which does tie into what you're doing as an indie developer, right? You don't exactly have the resources and budget of a AAA publisher, right?
Exactly.
But also in gameplay itself, I feel like it does also tie into that, because when you are limited in, like, for example, in your fighting games, how you can go about your offensive pressure, it forces you to get more creative between both the offense and defensive side of the game and that neutral, right? You can't just attack until you open up the opponent, or, practice some very strong block pressure and mix-ups until the opponent gets opened up, or they happen to use the right defensive mechanic for that situation to kind of knock you away or whatever. It generally creates this more of an ebb and flow, right? When you have limitations on both offense and defense to between the two, right? The swinging pendulum, so to speak, that goes back and forth rather than staying on one side for very long. And personally, those are the types of, especially in PvP, types of games I enjoy the most are the ones where it's more like a pendulum. It swings back and forth frequently throughout the match, where it's a back and forth rather than one person being able to hold on to their advantage for too long. But and I know you're working on a fighting game that's like a platform fighter, traditional fighter hybrid, right?
Exactly. I'm trying to use it as a transition point from someone who's completely unfamiliar with fighting games and has a number of things they don't like about traditional fighting games. I'm trying to bridge that gap, essentially, because we do have a lot of, for example, casual fans who would really, really enjoy Smash Brothers, for example, being the platform fighter. And it's a lot. There's a very, very big gap between the intuitive design of Smash Brothers versus even something like Street Fighter being relatively straightforward. There's a lot of things that are a bit of a steep hill to learn from the beginning, like holding back to block, for example.
Yeah.
It sounds a little unintuitive, especially considering most people would look at that as Oh, well, in order to defend, I have to literally give my opponent space. But what a lot of people don't understand is that the thing most people would end up doing is crouch blocking, which
Yeah.
doesn't sound necessarily intuitive. You wouldn't crouch block by default in a real fight. But given that we have...
Yeah, no, I like that you brought that up, because that reminds me of a tweet I saw recently where it was like a scrub quotes tweet or something, but someone pointed out, because it was a person who said that when is so-and-so game going to implement a block button, or that should implement a block button, because holding back to block just doesn't make any sense to me. And, they praised Mortal Kombat for having the block button as a 2D game. And I thought it made me think, and I thought about it because a lot of people were trying to clown on them, but I'm like, no, actually, as someone who grew up on 3D fighters, like Soul Calibur was my first fighting game I really got into ever, and that has a block button because of the 8-way run, right? And then Dead or Alive also has a block button. Actually, among 3D fighters, Tekken's the only one that doesn't, and that's the one also that plays the most like a 2D game out of all the 3D ones. But it makes more sense, I think, honestly, to have a block button. If you take any 3D fighting games, like not traditional 3D fighting games, but like, your arena fighters, they always have a block button, right? Because back to block wouldn't be a thing. It would be like down to block or something weird like that. So, if anything, holding a button to block is actually more intuitive to more types of people who don't already have that, indoctrination of back to block from 2D fighters. So I like how you brought that up, because that ties exactly into something I just recently saw, like, kid you not, like 3 or 4 days ago.
I think I saw the exact same tweet too. I'm never gonna stop laughing at the oh, I hate that my opponent gets to block for free just by giving up space, or something along that lines. Of one of the responses.
That's crazy. So yeah, and I like that you're, like you were pointing out, you're trying to design your game to be that bridge between platform fighters, which are generally more approachable to people, like, Smash Brothers, and traditional fighting games by adding some of the mechanics there that are a little bit more intuitive to more people. And all while doing that within, like we said before, the limitations of what the resources available to you as an independent developer, but also by kind of combining certain design elements in the gameplay of both freedom and limitation, right? Because platform fighters are known for their freedom of movement and positioning compared to traditional fighters. You're not stuck in a box with your opponent. And so you're giving them that freedom, right? That makes the game feel good to more people. But you are adding certain mechanical limitations in order to give your game structure.
I think the biggest thing I'm trying to focus on with this is I do enjoy when a game has more decisions to make, but we do know that that's sort of an inverse of limitation. If you're just playing rock, paper, scissors with your opponent, you have clearly set limitations, but that's different from all the movement you'd have in a platform fighter, for example. So to get around that, I'm trying to make it to where every decision, including movement, is sort of on a scaling graph of higher risk, high reward, or more deliberate. You can easily spend your time walking around, but that won't require you to lock yourself into an option, for example. But you're not going to move around very quick, and if you only spend your time walking, then it's much easier to approach you. However, if you're spending your time running around, jumping, or using air dashes frequently, every time you do that, you are momentarily, at least in the design of my game, you're momentarily locked or limiting other options. As you make your movement stronger, you make explicitly your defense or your offense weaker because you're trying to get yourself into a better position, or at least check for what your opponent is doing. So
Okay, so basically you are structuring your game around certain specific rules, the balancing factor being that risk reward. But basically when you have more options available to you, those options all carry a lower risk reward. But if you commit harder to a higher risk option, the potential reward is higher.
Exactly. There's going to be stuff like you get a lot more flexible movement with jumping and dashing, for example, but each one of those will deprive you of a few frames of actionability. So if you spend your time trying to run around and dash everywhere, you are a lot more vulnerable to a punish from a harder read from your opponent. Whereas if you walked around and just sat there ready to block, sure, you'd be put on the defensive the defense more often, but you'd be harder to immediately punish since you'd be ready with stronger defense, but with weaker movement.
Yeah, so you're not allowing players to do everything all the time. It more depends on how hard they want to commit to what they're currently doing.
Exactly.
And I like that. That actually is, I actually think that's a really good example of limitations adding structure and depth, because now the onus is on the players to decide, do I want to play it safer and have more options available to me, or do I want to go in and have less options, but the options I do have are going to be perhaps a bit stronger or higher potential reward if it works successfully. That's actually a nice, I feel like that is a nice structure, a nice way to kind of build your games, your game feel and balance around. So yeah, that's actually great to learn. Very fascinating. I'm curious to see how that ends up in the playable builds.
I'm happy to take a few guesses here and there because I don't exactly have too many games I'm trying to pull from. I'm mostly trying to pull from Super Smash Bros. Melee and many of its derivatives like Slap City or Rivals of Aether for at least having a lot more of the sort of, I'd say, enhanced vertical mobility, the fact that you can move across platforms very easily in those games, as opposed to, say, more recent Smash Brothers iterations where jumps are kind of super committal, but in games where you have the air dodges, for example, people are wave dashing everywhere and you can wave land on. I have kind of an emphasis I'm trying to place on wave landing for movement rather than wave dashing specifically, because I'm trying to make the wave dashes themselves a lot more committal as an option rather than only having, say, 4 frames that you're giving up. It could be something like 10 if you're trying to do that sort of movement specifically.
Yeah, so that, like, because unlike in Super Smash Bros. Melee, where wave dashing opened up all available options to players, all their grounded options while having dash-like movement, like the run movement speed anyway. If you're committing to the wave dashing, you're kind of giving up the like start and stopping animations basically where you're vulnerable.
Exactly.
Before you can act. So you got to call out the opponent, like maybe rather use it for maybe to whiff, to whiff bait, right? Like dash away, force a whiffed attack, dash back in, and then punish rather than just dashing all the time. It's more of a concerted decision you made to try and call something out.
Exactly.
That's awesome, actually. I like that. Also, I believe you're working on more than just that platform fighter, right? You're kind of toying around with a few other types of games in terms of design?
I am currently, just because I am working on a platform fighter that's using someone else's code alongside it. I'm using someone else's engine as a base, but then building it a lot on top of it by changing out a lot of pieces. That one I'm more hesitant to show on stream because, one, now that I'm getting to a lot more of the more complex and difficult to code parts, I think it's a lot better if I can focus on that off stream. Plus, I do feel a little hesitant about streaming me developing with someone else's code available on screen, and that's why I don't save the VODs of that specifically.
Okay.
However, the past few weeks I have been working on a Bullet Heaven game since a lot of my fans have been asking about the design of that specifically, and that's what's been going smoothly, and I believe that might be what you have available for the video preview.
Yes, that is actually what's on screen right now, the game in the vein of like Vampire Survivor and Hollow Cure, correct?
Exactly. And that's been coming along pretty well so far. Those are the only 2 projects I'm currently working on, and the Vampire Survivor one is more of something to put out there rather than something I am trying to do as a big officially structured project. I'm doing that mostly to show off to the fans and try to recycle some ideas with them. But given that it is a much lower bar to cross and a much easier game to develop, I might do something bigger, more grand with it, but so far it's kind of a low committal project for me.
Yeah, but it's also kind of to keep the muscles strong, so to speak. You're working out the programming muscles, you're getting by working on it, you're getting more efficient at certain coding techniques and stuff. And like you said, it's a smaller project, just a little side thing, but you know, it's still going to give you some valuable experience, of course, that you can use in all sorts of other games. And something I find interesting too, working on that kind of game, is like, as we've seen in games like Vampire Survivor and Holocure, they can be highly addictive despite how simple they are. And there are games that are very much, I think, built on limitations, and that can tie into this, because like the guy who developed Vampire Survivor was a one-man dev, and he just made it for fun. You know, it was like a small project, and he sold it for like, what, $3, I think? And it just hit big.
It might be 5.
3 to 5 maybe. Yeah, it was like very, very cheap, very cheap. And I mean, it auto attacks. You know, it auto attacks in the direction you're pointing, and so you just move. You have the auto attacks, and the depth in that doesn't come from any kind of mechanical execution, but rather from the roguelike elements, what kind of upgrades and abilities you choose. And so you're going for something similar to that, right?
Yeah, a big part of roguelikes in general are popular among programmers mostly because it fits into the culture of, hey, we can do math and work on algorithms very well, but not very many of us are artists. If you look at the oldest roguelikes, a lot of them just chart things out onto an ASCII grid, and I think that's part of like what we are talking about with limitations. If you can't get by with an extremely visible and obvious aesthetic presentation of having great visual or sound design or something that's immediately eye-catching, you have to dive into making your game a lot more mechanically or gameplay-wise interesting to make up for that.
Yeah, because like we, you know, as people who've played games for quite a long time, we know the graphics don't always have to be the prettiest. We don't need photorealism in all our games. And as long as the game is fun. Fun comes first. You know, I mean, that's how Nintendo has always made banger games, right? It's like they're never the most graphically impressive and, you know, hardware. You know, their hardware is always behind a generation or two in terms of strength on their consoles, but their games are just so fun that people love them. They're like instant classics more often than not, and so
Exactly.
And so like that just ties into it, you know. And I honestly think that is part of where the limitation breeds creativity from Nintendo developers, where that kind of comes in, because back in the day, they did have a lot of limitations in what they could do, especially on those old 16-bit consoles, right? And so, but they made the games so fun that they are timeless. They used those limitations as an excuse to get creative and to make games that were fun despite those limitations. And I think that is something that honestly should be, what's what I'm looking for, embraced by more people, both on the development and the player side of things. You know, is finding, having an open mind to things that can be fun despite having limitations. Because like I mentioned in my solo video in Morning Boot Up, limitations doesn't always mean restrictive and unfun, right? It just means that there's a bit more structure. You know, you can't just go crazy and do everything. Right? And I feel like that's very important in PvP games, but it also is kind of important in a lot of PvE games too, because not every single player or, you know, cooperative player versus environment game is meant to make the player feel, you know, just insanely powerful, right? Because if you're too powerful, then where's the challenge? And challenge is important for satisfaction, you know, overcoming that challenge. I'm sure you've seen that chart, right? The angle, and it's like the sweet spot between challenge and proficiency, and that's how you hit flow and maximum enjoyment.
I don't think I've seen that one specifically.
Okay, yeah, it was a chart that essentially was supposed to visualize how like flow state and like maximum enjoyment of an activity psychologically comes into play. And basically it's when you hit that sweet spot between the level of challenge and your level of proficiency, to the point where it's just challenging enough that it's satisfying to overcome, but not so challenging that at your current proficiency level it just feels daunting or unwinnable, unbeatable. Yeah. And that's when you hit that maximum, you know, player enjoyment, or in the case of, you know, very engaging kind of like, especially in athletics, but that's where you hit flow state, you know, which, I mean, happens in athletics and in games. I mean, I'm sure you've had situations where you've been playing a game and like you just hit that perfect flow. You're doing things perfectly. You get that excellent run, and it doesn't even feel like you're necessarily having to think too much about it. It just all clicks, everything falls into place.
I've mostly been having that as I've entered fighting game tournaments. It's been kind of a weird situation of either trying to fight my friends who don't play fighting games, that's not challenging enough. And then sometimes I try to, for example, with playing Strive, go onto the tower, and the only people still playing on the ranked systems are either a lot of people that are going to be just below me, or a few people who are going to be very, very far above. Well, it turns out there's a lot of folks on my level in the FGC which are good, but not too good. And I've actually hit that low state several times getting into the tournaments, although that's usually lasting me up until top 4 or so. Because usually the first or second place guys are still way leagues beyond my level.
Killers, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I know that feel too, from back when I used to compete in Tekken 7 and Smash Brothers for Wii U. I know in Tekken 7 monthly, I did manage to hit 7th place at one point, and then tied for 7th with someone else, and then and I hadn't competed in that many tournaments at that point. And then in Smash, I was like consistently making like the power ranked top 15 players in the region, or the area more accurately, really work for their wins against me. Like I was holding my own with them. And them using high tier characters like Diddy Kong and Cloud and such, and Sheik in that game, which they were all crazy strong. And I was using Marth, Lucina, and Corrin. And then when it came to, though, unfortunately, since I didn't have the time to really memorize a lot of matchups, the more obscure matchups, people with like Bowser Jr. or Ryu or Mewtwo would just absolutely wreck me, or Peach, because I just had no experience fighting those characters, even online. Albeit the online was awful. It still is. That's an aside for another day, but dang, I really wish Smash Ultimate had better in that play, because I would still be playing it today if the online was more bearable.
If only.
Yeah,
if
that's
only.
the dream. But hey, we've got Rivals of Aether 2 coming out, and Dan Fornace, or Fornace, I forget how to pronounce his last name, he said that what he's doing with Rivals 2 is he's making the game that he wishes Smash Brothers was. Instead of trying to like be a different Smash, trying to copy Smash Brothers or just doing Rivals Aether 1 but in 3D, he's like, I'm making the game that I wish Smash Brothers was, including the quality of the online play. So I'm looking forward to that.
I'll definitely have to look into it more. I haven't paid too much attention to the development of the second game, but I do hold the first one as a special place in my heart.
Yeah, me too. Even though I haven't played it a whole lot, Rivals 1 was great.
I've done a few streams in the past, and I have thought about actually doing a few custom characters for it, but it turns out that it's kind of a bit of a high bar, and I can use that time towards my game specifically.
Then may I recommend, if you haven't already heard of it, Framemakers?
Framemaker? Yeah, I was expecting that.
As the Maker engine is supposed to really streamline making new characters once that comes out. So that may be right up your alley.
Absolutely. It was kind of a mess working with Rivals of Aether 1, because you had to get... Well, funny enough, it's actually built in Game Maker Studio, which is what I'm using for my own personal game, so I have a bit of experience working with it, but because of the way it's set up, it's still a little tedious getting some of the stuff out there. Like, all the sprites have to be imported as a strip. You have to have a very long image of all the sprites in order rather than just being able to get it. Well, all the sprites per animation rather than being able to directly import GIFs like what you can do with the like your idle animation needs to be a long strip of each individual frame, which I think there's ways to transfer that out of a GIF, for example, but the actual IDE for Game Maker Studio itself lets you import GIFs, but I don't think, or at least Rivals of Aether doesn't let you import GIFs specifically for animations. And then you have situations of
so you have to draw them out in game, each frame.
Not really. You just when you have a character that you mod into the game, you place the sprites into your characters folder that are going to be out in the strips like that. But
Gotcha.
there are some very weird settings with trying to handle things like that. For example, one thing that I definitely had to code a different animation handler for my game project was with things that aren't necessarily fighting games, you have an expectation that all the frames of an animation are going to run at the same frame rate.
Mm-hmm.
But in fighting games, we have the very specific differences of frame data. And if you have a character that's, say, animated at 15 frames per second, then that means you're going to have 4 in-game frames for every frame of the animation, but you're going to have to do 2 frames here, 3 frames here. Since you have to focus a lot more on the animation principles of the attack itself, it's a little weird trying to get the properly spaced out animations handled into importing into Rivals of Aether, because you can't necessarily make every character having the same frames per second on every single animation. You got to vary it a little bit here and there to get your frame data correct.
Wow.
I started going off on a bit of a tangent there, but
No, that's fine. It sounds like there's definitely a lot to it. So you know more about the game dev stuff than I do, that's for sure. I'm more like, I lean more onto the psychology element of how like different game design principles and mechanics and stuff like that kind of interact with player psychology. That's more where I kind of focus my knowledge on, understanding how people are. I've always kind of had a propensity for that, you know, being able to take a person's behaviors or experiences and kind of being able to understand them, you know. So
exactly,
that's always been more my strength. And so I like to talk about, when I think about game design, I really like to think about how it interacts with the players, you know, and more than just the hardcore niche, because more often than not, the hardcore niche is much easier to please in some ways. Obviously, they can also be some of the more scrutinizing of a genre, but when you take someone who's not already in that hardcore niche, you find some new perspectives. And I just name dropped the little subtitle for the show. Didn't even mean to. But yeah, you find like perspectives that differ from the people who are already accustomed to the genre or the game, and it really illuminates some very interesting thought processes, like the aforementioned, you know, a block button situation, you know, comment online, and people who are already used to fighting games kind of trying to clown on them for suggesting that. But when you think about it from you know, eyes that aren't just FGC hardcore, someone who's played them for 10, 20, however many years, you kind of realize, yeah, no, that's actually a game design element that we take for granted because we're so used to it. But for many people who aren't already accustomed to it, it's awkward. You know, they have to train it into their muscle memory, into their minds to do.
Yeah,
and we just don't realize that.
Having a button for that action specifically is just way more intuitive. I actually have a friend I've been fighting a lot in Grand Blue, and I'm getting frequently hit by our cross-ups because I'm too used to holding back to block, but the block button in that game will still end up guarding against cross-ups.
Yep.
And it's just kind of a layer that we have different between us, and so there's actually completely different strategies that work on me versus working on her.
Huh. So a situation where the player's limitations, whether that be you not being used to using a block button, or you know, her not being accustomed to using back to block or down backing, it leads to a different interaction in the mechanics, actually.
Exactly.
So that's actually pretty cool. And being a game that kind of catered its design around being approachable to both, you know, veterans and new players, it actually leans into being able to make a rewarding experience for both sides.
Absolutely. I think there's kind of a weird, well, as part of an anecdote of this, I did talk about the block button being automatic cross-up protection, essentially. I do generally like the idea of cross-ups in a fighting game just because I think that's another layer of, well, without getting too far out there, that's another layer of blocking that you got to do. If you hold back to block and your opponent slips behind you, realistically in a fight, if you're caught off guard and someone hits you in the back, you're not expecting to block that unless you're prepared for it. And that's why you have cross-ups being a completely wildly different way to open up someone.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I'm trying to implement both hold back to block and a block button into my game simultaneously. And it's a little interesting trying to think of how to cater to both of those situations, because the expectation is if you cross someone up, someone should have to be mentally prepared for that.
Right.
And so I have to handle a situation where if you attack someone from behind, you need to be able to handle that both with a block button situation and with holding back to block.
Well, if I remember correctly, I think Grand Blue Fantasy Versus makes it so that if you use the block button, the active frame, so to speak, of the blocking starts up slower. So it's more vulnerable at the beginning and ending of the blocking period when you're using the button, to kind of trade off from the cross-up protection. So if like someone, reacts to a jump in, for a cross-up, a jumping cross-up attack too late, even if they press the block button, if they did it too late, it won't block the cross-up, because it's the period of time where you're actually blocking stuff, it happens slower than if you use back to block. That could be a potential way around that, is like, as a platform fighter, if you're going to have some form of blocking that's a little more Smash Brothers like, and usually there's some sort of visual to represent that, like the bubble shield or whatever, then you can have the startup frames be slower when using the block button to kind of create that risk reward, right? It blocks cross-ups more reliably, but you have to use it a lot more predictively. You have to press that button sooner.
It's kind of a shame that I'm trying to restrict myself to the traditional fighting game environment, because what I've thought about, which seems like it would be very interesting, is if in having a Smash Brothers like game, but instead of having the dodge rolls or spot dodges, if the defense wasn't entirely focused around shield shifting, for example, which is something I was wanting to implement in the game if I wasn't specifically trying to do it with having a lot more of a way to teach a traditional fighter. Because, for example, if your shield only blocked maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of your character, there'd be a lot more intuition of having to use a block button and hold it in the direction that the attack is coming from, and that would be how you measure someone getting hit by high-low mix-ups. I think that's how Melee handled shields, with shield poking, and the fact that the bubble you had of the shield was also the actual hurt box.
Right.
And if you blocked for long enough, you couldn't actually block the corners of your body. But Smash Brothers didn't ever seem to go far enough in that direction.
Yeah, the shield shifting does still exist, but since shields drain slower than in Melee, the prevalence of that mechanic and its interactions with attacks is much less.
Is there still shield poking in the newest games? Like if someone's shield bubble gets small?
Yeah, it happens sometimes. It just doesn't happen as often, so when it does happen, it really sticks out. Like I've used to watch competitive matches, and every once in a while, like say a multi-hit attack would get through someone's shield because the shield had already drained, it was too small, and it just
couldn't block the hitbox.
Couldn't block the hitbox, and they just got caught at like the toes or something like that. Usually it was low, a low hitbox that would catch them with the shield poke. So yeah, it still happens, just not as often as back in Melee, because the shields drain slower, they shrink slower. But I like that idea where making it like much more, I guess you could say, binary in its properties, which is one thing that I praise like Virtua Fighter for, is a lot of things having binary properties of this is steppable, this is not. And so if you make the right decision, you get rewarded consistently for making the right decision. There's no, why did this hit when I sidestepped it? Well, it depends. If you're at an angle, then you got to step this way, or you got to step this early, like in
weird
Tekken.
Tekken hitboxes.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I like when it's like binary and well, a form of limitation, right? Each thing has a limitation on what it works against, but that also adds depth in the decision making and interactions. And so I think making it so that like the shield mechanic, it blocks like high and mid or low and mid to kind of emulate the high block, low block, or standing block, crouching block from traditional fight games. That's actually a pretty good idea.
That's kind of the direction that I'm going with it. The block button by default will have you in a standing block, but if you hold down and block specifically, you'll get the crouching block. I'm not in this project specifically doing anything big with the shield shifting mechanics, but I thought about trying to make more of a specifically platform fighter sort of game that would use that as a mechanic.
Right.
I'm debating if I should still change how that factors into the game that I'm working on, because I really like the idea of doing defense based entirely around shield shifting, but that's to come up with the gameplay experimentations a lot later.
Yeah, and I do think something like that would have more of a strong place in a game that's a bit more grounded, you know, like maybe a platform fighter that doesn't have double jumping, for example. Because once you introduce like that type of air mobility, then the interactions could get really wonky if you have like that kind of binary shield shifting type blocking. Especially since you need, you know, the characters to always be facing each other for something like that to work as well. And then you would need attacks to have like much more, I guess, restricted or condensed hitboxes to make sure that it's more consistent, you know. That way when you're stand blocking, you don't get caught by a standing attack that, you know, kind of
barely clips your knee, and then that counts enough as a low.
Exactly. So it's definitely an interesting thought, and one I would like to see implemented into a game, but it definitely has further implications that cascade across, you know, everything from the movement to character facing direction and so on. So, and you know, character size on screen too, because if the characters are smaller on screen, like tends to be the case in platform fighters, then it'll be really hard to read the readability on where the attacks are coming from is going to be more difficult as well.
Yeah, so it would need to be really, really obvious that if an attack is high or low in that situation.
And then, of course, you also have the interactions on, like, if you're holding your block and then you want to drop through a platform. Well, down is your command usually to drop through a platform, unless you make it down and jump.
Which is actually what I'm doing in my game specifically.
Okay, so you already thought about that. Nice.
Yeah, I figured that jumping is core enough to the experience that it will specifically need its own dedicated button. On the subject of things being intuitive, I also did take a long time to, when I was first picking up fighting games, understand that, well, since holding up on your control stick is going to be a jump input in most 2D fighters, they remap a lot of anti-airs to, say, a heavy crouching button, like a crouching heavy punch in a lot of Street Fighter characters is going to be an anti-air rather than hitting in front of you.
Right.
Or crouch heavy slash for a lot of Guilty Gear characters. And then the very weird input of 6P, forward punch, being the dedicated Guilty Gear anti-air button. And
I always thought that was weird. Yeah.
Yeah, especially considering it. Yeah. With it making it's kind of becomes impossible to do an anti-air that would hit behind you for that very reason. So similarly enough, I'm trying to make it a lot more like Smash Brothers normal inputs, where you actually do have down and up, and if you aim upward, you'll get an upward swinging attack.
Yeah.
That's how you get your anti-airs out, not necessarily by doing a crouching heavy or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that is more intuitive. And the way that I've always been the kind of player in Smash Bros. Where I struggle when I can't turn off tap jump. So like in Smash, I need to jump button and I turn off up being jump. But in traditional fighters, like when I tried Fantasy Strike, you know, which lets you turn on up to jump and it has a jump button, a dedicated jump button, I always found the jump button awkward in that one because it plays more like a traditional 2D fighter. So it's super, it's a very wonky little wrinkle there.
Well, more traditional fighters aren't going to have, and that's something I found from trying to move around in that game. Even though I don't have a lot of character movesets perfectly implemented into the game, I still want to do the most important thing of a movement-based game and make sure the movement is correct before anything else. And after enough time, I just found that you really need a jump button when you interact with the verticality that much. In a traditional fighter, you have only that one plane that you're dealing with, so a jump button there would feel a little bit awkward, but
it's more horizontal than vertical. Yeah,
I feel like it's really necessary if you have that second layer platforms you even need to interact with.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, because unless you're talking about like Marvel's Capcom, where when you super jump, you're just like so high up on the screen that the other players are really low, you know, off screen. It's like generally they don't get very vertical. So yeah. But that's also a case, actually, that makes me think of a limitation that I always appreciated in the fighting games I actually enjoyed. I never liked when, like, in Marvel vs. Capcom's, how you could super jump so high up that the camera follows you up into the air, and then the other player is off screen. I'm like, I actually prefer the restricted camera to keep both players always visible, you know? I just feel like that most people would kind of have difficulty in remembering where they are, you know, if they're off screen, right? Especially in a game like that. So it's definitely something interesting to think about when it comes to like having that vertical mobility, you know, the freedom to go that high vertically, because then, I don't know, it can create some interesting little weirdness that can be off-putting, or, you know, can be something that just makes the game feel more epic, like the Marvel fans often felt like going airborne. And then, you know, I think the intent in the designers was that both players would jump up there and then they'd be fighting up in the air, and it would make it feel very dynamic and comic book like, you know, or
Well,
funny enough, much.
Have you ever had the chance to play Touhou 12.3?
I haven't, no.
That's another game I'm trying to draw a lot of inspiration from. That is a traditional 2D fighter, but the characters in that game take up about each half of the space that you'd find in a more traditional fighter. And in that game, you actually do have a lot more verticality, for one, because it's Touhou based.
Yeah, so
every character has 2 8-way air dashes that you can extend. So that game does end up with a lot more air battles like that, just because you have a lot more room for a character to move upwards onto the screen while still staying on screen. Whereas in a lot of the games where the characters are larger, the instant one character super jumps that high, you can't see who's still standing on the ground, and it becomes that much harder to defend against.
Right.
So, like you said, the character size is going to be a big part of that, and that you'd be able to give yourself a lot more of that verticality with the super jumps if your characters were just a little bit smaller.
Yeah, and so that's why I really wanted to talk to you about this, because as a game developer, you have to interact with various types of limitations a lot. You know, like you just mentioned, when you have a lot of vertical movement, well, now you have the, you know, tendency for one character to be partially or fully off screen. And then what does that do? You know, how does that interact with the players playing, right? How are they able to take in the information they need to be able to play properly, right? So sometimes in that situation, having a limitation of, like, you know, neither character can move so far away that they could be first one off screen. That limitation actually can make the game a little more approachable, mechanically speaking, and mentally.
And if they are restricted to a certain space from each other, then it's a lot harder to circle camp.
Yeah, and like one way around that is like how Smash has the zoom in and out when the characters are closer or further apart. That way they're always on screen, and the only way to score KO is to knock someone off screen. That's mechanically the whole point. So if you keep the characters on screen until one gets KO'd, then, you know, it sells that mechanic, but it also keeps the game feeling visually, you know, readable and approachable. But if you want there to be more nuanced hitbox and blocking and stuff like that interactions, you're going to need the characters to be a bit larger on screen. Therefore, the camera will be closer, which will restrict their movement a little bit, or how far they can move.
And finding the balance in that specifically is what's given me a lot of trouble right now, because I need to completely rescale all of the character graphics and the stage graphics around that. And yeah, I can zoom in and out, but not having perfect zoom like that in a game can make some of the graphics a little bit ugly.
Right.
Also really helps with the game feel, having the characters be completely readable at whatever scale that they currently are, whatever resolution their sprites are at.
Yeah, readability is a limitation. It's based on human limitation, right? You have to base it around what people can actually perceive and how quickly they can perceive it, and on average, and you know, just stuff like that. Game development is literally wrestling with limitations to make something that is fun. And sometimes for that, you do have to place limitations upon the players. That way they don't break your game too horribly.
Exactly.
So yeah, no, it's definitely a very fascinating conversation to have, because a lot of players who don't think about the other sides of things beyond what they see, you know, right in front of their face, 2 inches in front of their face, they don't realize that limitations are extremely important. You can't just give players all the freedom all the time, because then it's hardly a game, you know? There's hard, you know, if you're too free, how can you lose, right? Or
the more decisions you have, the more decisions that are possible to be made sometimes even has the opposite effect of, like, as you have that many more options, it's a lot more likely that one of them is going to bubble up to the top and be the stronger option. So in the end,
centralization.
If one of your choices is way stronger, you're not even making as many decisions, even if you have more options.
Yep.
So it has the opposite effect.
Kind of like Tekken's movesets, right? There's like hundreds of lines, but generally you want to focus on like 10 to 20 key moves and build your game plan around that.
Exactly.
The rest is bloat, right? And if you don't place any limitations, then you get really bloated gameplay that ends up being surprisingly centralized, over centralized, and therefore kind of takes away.
Exactly.
So it's weird. That's something that most people don't think of, but like giving too much freedom actually can come around and full circle and end up being limiting, especially in a PvP environment where players are going against each other. And so then if you're not using the best options, the over-centralized options, then you're just putting yourself at a disadvantage. And therefore, choice has been removed. Freedom has been removed. And then a very strict meta takes away player choice, you know, and what's viable. So limitations are actually important for balancing the game to give it the depth, because depth comes from the variety of viable choices you have, right?
Yeah.
So depth is not the same as complexity, and so limitations are actually crucial to making that tenable in any kind of way that can lead to a fun game. Because I mean, humans can only keep track of so many things at once, right? Even the best players can't do everything if there's just too much to do or too much available to them at all times.
Eventually overload that mental stack.
Yeah, so then what they're going to do is they're going to, analyze it, break it down mechanically, find what's strongest, and just stick to that, like you said. So some limitations, some restrictions to give it structure will actually make it a more varied and fun game, ironically enough.
Exactly. And it's a lot easier to learn and identify what your choices are if it's more specifically streamlined like that.
I like that. I like how you put that. I do, this has been a great conversation. I don't want this to drag on for too terribly long, and I feel like we got some really good, fascinating stuff from your perspective as a game developer. Like I said earlier, you have certain things in your mind and experience that I just don't, because I'm not in the coding and I haven't designed a game myself. So having you here was a great thing for the discussion, I think, and really enjoyed it.
Me too. I'm always happy to provide some perspective, and a lot of those things, like especially the character scaling, are things I've only learned recently, so in a short bit of time I might have a completely different idea to put on the table.
Nice. Yeah, and maybe we can revisit it again sometime in the future.
I'd be delighted.
Yep. So, real quick, for those who are listening or watching, where can the people listening or watching find you?
I am usually streaming on twitch.tv/XanderTuring, all one word, no underscores. Currently, I'm not doing too much in the fighting game department, though I might be picking that back up with Street Fighter 6, which I would be delighted to talk to you about your opinions on sometime soon.
Yeah.
I do have a YouTube channel which I will be needing to upload VODs to soon, but that is the first place you'll be able to find me, is on Twitch. I'm not often advertising on Twitter or posting many devlogs there. YouTube is mostly for VOD re-uploads, so if you would like to talk specifically about game design, then you can catch me on the game dev streams, which happen every, coincidentally enough, Saturday. So
And then other than the game dev streams, you also tend to play a lot of games like you play Guilty Gear Strive as your main fighting game, and then you play a lot of you also have been recently learning that Toho fighting game, and then you play a lot of roguelikes, right?
Mostly roguelikes. As I said, they're pretty popular among other programmers, so I always try to be doing one roguelike a week. Right now I think we actually just finished one of our rotations, so I'm taking a bit of a break away from that,
Mhm.
but soon enough I'd love to be hopping back into it. In fact, I might be trying to pick up that Pokemon Emerald ROM hack that turns the entire experience into a roguelike.
Yeah, Pokemon Rogue version or Emerald Rogue or something like that. I forget what it's called. Yeah, I recently read
Something
about
along
that
those
too.
lines.
Oh, that seems pretty interesting. So, yeah. So to those listening and watching, if you are interested in checking that out, go over to Xander Turing on Twitter and Twitch. Mostly Twitch. And
Mostly Twitch.
you do have a YouTube, but you said that's been a little dormant for a bit, right?
Yeah, I've been recently busy trying to pick up other parts of the game dev. I'm getting to the point where I am going to have to start getting formal documentation out and like character designs and design docs and stuff like that, since
Okay.
it looks like it's going to be getting to the point where I might have some people helping me soon.
Nice.
And because of that, I had to spend more of my free time on the game dev side of things rather than the VOD uploads. But for the most part,
Twitch.
my YouTube channel is currently used for VOD re-uploads. I'm not doing much in the way of clips or shorts on there for the moment.
Yeah, so Twitch is the place to find Xander.
For the moment.
Yeah.
Indeed.
All right. Well, I'll link that in the description and I'll tag you in the video title on YouTube. So thank you so much again for chatting with me for this. I think we're at almost an hour, maybe just under. So yeah, although obviously we weren't having this discussion for the entirety of it. I started recording just a little before, so close to an hour. But a lot of fascinating discussion. Really enjoyed it. Can't wait to talk to you again. And yeah, go check him out if you have the time. All right, so this has been Dr. Sam and Professor Xander Turing, and I'll see you next time.
Bye.
Sam here. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. That'll help me out a lot as I try to grow this channel and figure out what kind of content I want to continue making for you all. Also, feel free to comment your favorite parts or any other feedback and suggestions you might have. I'll see you there or in whatever I upload next. Have a good one.